the Anderson home sat on a quiet corner of Alder Ridge, a suburban neighborhood where almost nothing ever happened. The streets were lined with trimmed hedges, white fences, and family SUVs parked neatly in driveways. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other in the morning, where children rode bikes after school, and where neighbors assumed they knew who was safe and who wasn't. That was why no one thought much about Mike and Claire Anderson. To everyone around them, they were just another married couple trying to get through life. Quiet, polite, ordinary. But behind the walls of their home, the marriage had been falling apart for months. Claire Anderson was 31 years old, soft-spoken and intelligent, with a habit of smiling even when she was upset. Friends described her as thoughtful but guarded, someone who didn't like burdening other people with her problems. She had once been warm and easygoing, but in the months before her disappearance, those close to her noticed something had changed. She seemed distracted, nervous, like she was constantly rehearsing what she wanted to say but never actually saying it. Her husband, Mike Anderson, was 37 and worked in property maintenance. He came across as calm, practical, and reliable, the kind of man who knew how to fix anything. He rarely raised his voice in public, never seemed rattled, and had the kind of steady personality people instinctively trusted. That trust would later become one of the most disturbing parts of the case. To outsiders, their marriage looked stable. But privately, Claire had begun telling a very different story. She had confided in her sister, Megan, that Mike had become increasingly controlling over the past year. It wasn't always obvious at first. He never hit her. He didn't scream in front of people. Instead, it came in quieter forms, questioning where she had been, criticizing who she spoke to, checking her phone, making subtle comments that left her feeling guilty for wanting independence. Claire had started noticing how every disagreement somehow turned into her apologizing, even when she hadn't done anything wrong. Mike had a way of twisting conversations until she no longer trusted her own memory of what had happened. By the time she realized how deeply trapped she felt, she had already begun making plans to leave. She didn't tell many people. Only her sister knew the full truth. Claire had quietly contacted a lawyer. She had opened a separate savings account and transferred small amounts of money into it over time, careful not to make it obvious. She had even looked at apartments online and drafted a list of things she needed to take with her when she finally left. She wasn't planning to disappear. She was planning to leave properly, legally, safely, and with enough preparation to avoid a confrontation. But she also knew Mike well enough to understand that if he discovered her plans too early, things could become dangerous. On the morning of October 14th, just after 8 a.m., Mike Anderson called 911 and reported Claire missing. His voice was measured, controlled, and almost eerily composed. He told the dispatcher that he and Claire had argued the night before. According to him, the fight wasn't serious, just stress, marriage issues, the kind of thing couples go through. He said Claire had been emotional lately, overwhelmed and distant, and that sometime after midnight she must have left the house while he was asleep. When he woke up, she was gone. Her car was missing, her phone was off, and he had no idea where she might have gone. He sounded concerned, but not panicked. At the time, no one thought much of that. When officers arrived at the house, everything looked strangely normal. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, no visible blood, no obvious indication of violence. The bedroom was tidy. The kitchen looked clean. Mike walked the officers through the home with a quiet, cooperative demeanor, repeating the same explanation over and over. Claire had been under a lot of pressure. She'd been emotional. She probably just needed space. On the surface, it was plausible. Adults do leave. Marriages do break down. Missing person cases often begin with ordinary explanations. But some of the detectives on scene couldn't shake the feeling that something about Mike's version felt too neat. The first real red flags appeared when investigators began looking more carefully at Claire's belongings. Her handbag was still in the house. So was her daily medication. Her favorite pair of walking shoes sat neatly by the hallway bench. Her laptop charger remained plugged in beside the bed. These weren't dramatic clues on their own, but together they painted a troubling picture. People don't usually leave in the middle of the night without the things they rely on every day. If Claire had stormed out after an argument, where was she planning to go? Why leave her essentials behind? Why turn off her phone? Why not contact her sister, who she spoke to constantly? That same afternoon, detectives sat down with Megan, Claire's older sister. It was Megan who shifted the entire direction of the case. She told them Claire had not been unstable or confused or on the verge of running away. Claire had been making a plan. She had spoken to a lawyer. She had quietly started separating her finances. She had even told Megan that she was waiting for the right time to leave Mike because she didn't trust how he would react if he felt he was losing control. Megan described Mike as manipulative and emotionally exhausting, the kind of man who needed to feel like he was always in charge. Suddenly, Mike's calm demeanor didn't look like strength anymore. It looked rehearsed. Police began digging into Claire's recent activity. They confirmed the private savings account. They found email exchanges with a divorce attorney. They also found that Claire had searched for short-term rental apartments and even created a checklist titled Important Documents. Nothing in her digital trail suggested she was planning to vanish. Everything suggested she was trying to build an exit strategy. That discovery made investigators look at Mike differently. And once they did, the cracks in his story began to widen quickly. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood and collected surveillance footage from nearby homes. Doorbell cameras, garage cameras, street-facing security systems. Anything that might show Claire leaving the property. At first, the footage seemed to support Mike's version. Around 3:12 a.m., Claire's car could be seen pulling out of the neighborhood and turning onto the main road. But when investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame and enhanced the driver's side image, the truth became impossible to ignore. Claire wasn't driving the car. Mike was. That one detail changed everything. When detectives brought Mike back in for a formal interview and confronted him with the footage, he didn't deny being in the car. Instead, he calmly adjusted his story. He said Claire had asked him to move it earlier in the night because she was upset and didn't want to wake the neighbors. He claimed he simply forgot to mention it because he was tired and overwhelmed. But that explanation only made things worse. Why would he omit such an important detail in a missing person case? Why did his version keep changing each time police found a contradiction? Mike tried to keep his tone even, but investigators could see the shift. He was no longer just recounting events. He was improvising. As detectives widened the investigation, they obtained a warrant for Mike's digital records. What they found was deeply unsettling. In the weeks leading up to Claire's disappearance, Mike had searched phrases like how long before a body starts to smell, how police track missing persons, best way to remove blood from wood, and decomposition in walls. He had also deleted dozens of text messages, moved money out of their shared account, and made several unexplained late-night trips to a hardware store. One of those purchases included masonry materials, construction adhesive, and heat-resistant plaster. At this point, investigators no longer believed Claire had left voluntarily. They believed she was dead. The problem was, they still didn't know where she was. A second search of the Anderson home was conducted with forensic specialists. This time, investigators looked at the house not as a residence, but as a potential crime scene. They sprayed luminol in several areas, examined drains, checked trash disposal records, and inspected structural changes around the property. Much of the home appeared spotless, almost too spotless. Certain surfaces had been aggressively cleaned. The living room carpet had recently been shampooed. A section of the fireplace appeared newly refinished, though there was no obvious reason for recent renovation. Mike had mentioned nothing about home repairs. That was when they brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs moved calmly through the house, sniffing doorways, corners, and furniture with routine focus. But once they entered the living room, their behavior changed. Both dogs independently alerted near the base of the fireplace wall. One pawed at the surface. The other remained fixed in place, nose pressed close to the lower stonework. The handlers noted a clear death odor response. Investigators stared at the fireplace, clean, modern, and seemingly ordinary. But now it looked different. Too fresh. Too perfect. A warrant was signed almost immediately. When the wall was opened, officers uncovered layer after layer of recently installed material. Beneath the stone facing and reinforced backing, wrapped inside a sealed cavity, they found Claire Anderson's body. She had never left the house. The medical examiner later concluded that Claire had died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, likely during a violent domestic confrontation. Investigators believe the argument began late that night after Mike discovered evidence that Claire was preparing to leave him. Her lawyer notes had been hidden, but not well enough. A printed apartment listing was later found in the kitchen trash, partially burned. Police believe Mike confronted her, accused her of betrayal, and lost control when Claire made it clear she was done with the marriage. What began as an argument escalated into murder. But what made the case especially chilling was not just the killing itself, it was what happened after. According to the prosecution, Mike spent the next several hours staging Claire's disappearance with shocking precision. He cleaned visible evidence, moved her car out of the neighborhood to create the illusion that she had driven away, returned home, and then began concealing her body inside the fireplace wall. Investigators believe he worked through the early morning hours, using tools and materials he had quietly gathered over several weeks. Whether he had planned for murder or only for the possibility of needing to fix something afterward was never fully proven. But what was clear was this: once Claire was dead, Mike did not panic. He constructed a lie. And he committed to it completely. For nearly 2 weeks after Claire's body was hidden inside the wall, Mike continued living in the house as though nothing had happened. He slept there, ate there, watched television in the same room. He answered sympathy texts. He made emotional social media posts asking for Claire to come home. He spoke to neighbors with tired eyes and a concerned expression. He even invited family members over to discuss search efforts. Family members who unknowingly sat only feet away from where Claire had been hidden. That detail would later haunt everyone involved. When Mike was brought in for his final interrogation, detectives approached it differently. They already knew he was lying. What they wanted now was pressure. They wanted him to feel the walls closing in. The interview room was cold and brightly lit. Mike sat upright with his hands folded, trying to maintain the same steady image he had worn from the beginning. Across from him, Detective Elena Ruiz and Detective Marcus Hale laid out the evidence piece by piece. They did not accuse him immediately. Instead, they walked him through the timeline carefully, forcing him to confront each contradiction. At first, Mike stayed calm. He said Claire had been struggling emotionally. He said she wanted space. He said the searches on his laptop were taken out of context. He had morbid curiosity and liked reading crime forums. He claimed the money transfers were just financial organization. Every answer sounded technically possible, but emotionally hollow. Then Detective Ruiz placed a still image from the surveillance footage on the table. Mike driving Claire's car at 3:12 a.m. He stared at it for a few seconds, then exhaled through his nose and said, "I already explained that." Detective Hale didn't respond. He simply slid another folder forward. Inside were printouts of Mike's search history, then the hardware store receipts, then photographs of the open fireplace, then finally, the autopsy report. That was the moment the room changed. Mike's jaw tightened. His posture shifted. For the first time in the entire investigation, he looked like a man who understood the performance was over. Detective Ruiz leaned forward and said quietly, "You didn't report a missing wife. You reported a story. And now it's falling apart." Mike looked down at the table. No tears. No visible remorse. Just silence. Detective Hale continued, his voice flat and deliberate. "She was planning to leave you. She had a lawyer. She had money set aside. She was done. And you couldn't stand it." Still, Mike said nothing. Then Ruiz delivered the final blow. "She didn't disappear, Mike. She died in that house. And you put her in a wall." Mike closed his eyes. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead vent. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. That was as close to a confession as detectives would ever get. He never fully admitted to killing Claire in explicit detail. He never offered a full narrative. But in court, prosecutors didn't need one. The physical evidence, digital evidence, surveillance footage, financial trail, forensic findings, and his own collapsing timeline painted a complete picture. The jury returned a guilty verdict. What began as a missing person case ended as something much darker, a case of control, obsession, and the terrifying lengths one man went to in order to keep his version of reality intact. The most unsettling part wasn't just that Claire was murdered. It was that the person responsible stood in front of everyone, calmly asking for help finding her, while knowing exactly where she was the entire time. Because Claire Anderson was never missing. She was exactly where Mike left her. Hidden inside the home where she should have been safest. And by the time anyone realized the truth, he had already spent days pretending she had simply vanished.